Hey there. Ready for a deep dive?
Always up for exploring fascinating topics.
Awesome. Today we're tackling the U.S. Constitution. You know, that document written centuries ago but still impacts our lives today.
It's truly remarkable how relevant it remains.
Right. It's not just some historical artifact. It's like every time there's a debate about, say, gun control or states' rights, the Constitution is right there in the middle of it.
Absolutely. It's the foundation of so many of our current discussions.
So we've got a collection of excerpts here, ready to dig in and see what we can learn.
Sounds like a great deep dive. I'm excited to see what we uncover.
Okay, let's jump right in. So the Constitution replaced the Articles of Confederation back in 1789.
Ah, yes, the Articles.
It sounds like they weren't exactly a smashing success. What went wrong?
Well, imagine a government that can't effectively collect taxes, really struggles to maintain an army.
Oh, wow.
And they can't even stop states from constantly bickering with each other.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It pretty much was. That was the reality under the Articles of Confederation. The central government they created was simply too weak to function effectively.
So they basically had to go back to the drawing board.
Pretty much. They realized they needed a major system upgrade.
That's where the Constitutional Convention comes in, right?
Exactly. That's where the real action began.
And from what I've seen in these sources, there were some serious debates, especially about representation. Big states versus small states, right?
Oh, absolutely. It was a major point of contention.
I bet. Sounds like it could have been a recipe for gridlock.
You're not wrong. The tension was palpable. You had the larger states pushing for the Virginia Plan, which advocated for representation based on population. More people, more power.
Makes sense from their perspective.
Right. But then the smaller states, they countered with the New Jersey Plan, where each state, no matter its size, would get an equal say.
Wow. I can see how those two plans would clash.
Oh, they did. It nearly led to a complete breakdown of the convention. It was a real nail-biter.
So how on earth did they find a solution? Did one side just back down?
Not quite. It took a truly ingenious compromise. The Connecticut Compromise.
Okay, I've heard of that. But honestly, the Great Compromise sounds way cooler.
I agree. It's a much more fitting name. And it's this very compromise that gave us the bicameral system we have today. The House of Representatives based on population, and a Senate where each state gets 2 senators regardless of size.
Pretty clever way to balance those competing interests.
It was a stroke of genius that allowed the convention to move forward and ultimately create a functioning federal government.
But did it actually work? Did this compromise really satisfy both sides? Or did it maybe create some long-term consequences that we're still dealing with?
Well, no compromise is perfect, right? But the Connecticut Compromise did manage to bridge what seemed like an unbridgeable divide.
Right, they were really at odds.
They were, but you're right to point out those long-term consequences. The structure of the Senate, with its equal representation for each state, it has a big impact on power dynamics even today.
Can you give us an example of how that plays out in modern times?
Sure. Think about Wyoming, which has a population smaller than many cities, but it has the same number of senators as California, the most populous state.
Whoa, that's a stark contrast.
It is, and it can sometimes lead to situations where the Senate doesn't truly reflect the will of the majority of Americans.
That's a really interesting point, and it's amazing to see how a compromise from centuries ago is still shaping the political landscape today.
It really highlights how much those founding documents continue to resonate.
For sure. But shifting gears a bit, one thing that really struck me while going through these sources is how they address the issue of slavery.
Oh, yes.
It's such a stark reminder of how different things were back then.
It is.
Could you walk us through how the Constitution handled this incredibly sensitive topic?
Of course. It's a complex and sensitive topic, and you're right, it highlights the contradictions and compromises made during the founding era. To understand how they approached it, you have to remember that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, they were very aware of the deep divisions within the newly formed nation.
Oh, I bet.
The southern states were economically and culturally dependent on slavery, and any attempt to abolish it outright would have likely caused them to reject the Constitution.
So they were walking a tightrope, trying to form a unified nation, but also grappling with this incredibly divisive issue. What did they ultimately decide to do?
They came up with a series of compromises. But while necessary for getting the Constitution ratified, these compromises cast a long shadow over the nation's future.
That's pretty heavy.
It is. The most infamous of these was the 3/5 compromise.
Oh, right, where slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person.
Exactly, and that was for the purposes of representation and taxation. This gave Southern states more political power in the House of Representatives, despite the fact that, slaves were denied basic rights and freedoms.
It's mind-boggling to think about. They were trying to create a government based on the ideals of liberty and equality, yet at the same time, they were solidifying the institution of slavery into the very document that defined those ideals.
It's a paradox, isn't it? It highlights the moral complexities of the time and the tough choices the framers faced. They were trying to create a unified nation out of 13 different colonies, each with vastly different interests. And while they didn't resolve the issue of slavery, they did manage to create a framework for a government that could, over time, be amended and reformed.
So it's like they built a house with some shaky foundations, but they also gave future generations the tools to renovate and reinforce it.
That's a great analogy.
But speaking of changes, it seems like the Constitution wasn't meant to be set in stone forever, right? The sources mention these things called amendments.
You're absolutely right. The framers understood that they couldn't anticipate every challenge or issue the nation would face.
It's like they were building a house, but knew the family might grow and need more space.
Exactly. So they wisely included Article 5, which outlines the process for amending the Constitution. But they also knew that changing the Constitution shouldn't be easy or quick. They wanted to make sure any changes had broad support and reflected a true national consensus.
Makes sense. So they made the amendment process pretty tough, right?
They did. It requires a supermajority vote in both houses of Congress to even propose an amendment. And then it needs ratification by 3/4 of the states.
Wow, that's a high bar to clear.
It is, which is why there have only been 27 amendments ratified since the Constitution was adopted.
So not impossible, but definitely not something you do on a whim.
Exactly. It's not like repainting a room. It's more like deciding to add a whole new wing to the house. It requires careful planning and everyone being on board.
I remember learning about the Bill of Rights in school. But from these sources, it sounds like there have been a lot of other amendments over the years. Any standouts that jump out at you?
Well, the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, are essential. They guarantee fundamental rights like freedom of speech and religion.
The cornerstones of our freedoms, for sure.
Right. But beyond those, the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, are incredibly significant. They were passed after the Civil War and represent a huge shift in the nation's legal and social landscape.
Okay, I'm sensing a story here. Tell me more about the Reconstruction Amendments and why they're so important.
Well, after the Civil War and the end of slavery, the nation was wrestling with how to integrate formerly enslaved people into society and how to guarantee their basic rights.
It was a whole new era.
It was. It led to a period known as Reconstruction, and these 3 amendments were at the heart of it. You see, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to everyone born or naturalized in the U.S. Crucially, this included formerly enslaved people.
It formally recognized them as citizens.
Yes, and it also guaranteed equal protection under the law for all citizens, aiming to correct past injustices.
That seems like a huge step forward. So the 13th Amendment ended slavery, and the 14th aimed to ensure equal rights for all citizens. What about the 15th?
The 15th Amendment tackled voting rights. It declared that the right to vote couldn't be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
A huge victory for racial equality.
Absolutely. Though it would still be decades before those rights were truly enforced and protected for all citizens.
It's amazing to see how the Constitution could be used to dismantle the very system of oppression that it once, kind of implicitly, allowed.
It speaks to the idea of it being a living document, capable of change and growth.
Right. But it also makes you think about how those early compromises, like the 3/5 compromise, had such lasting and damaging effects.
You've hit on a crucial point. The Constitution is powerful, capable of both progress and perpetuating injustice. It's up to each generation to grapple with its complexities and strive to make it live up to its highest ideals.
It's giving me a whole new perspective on this document. I used to think of it as static, almost untouchable. But now I see it as this evolving story full of triumphs and struggles, reflecting this ongoing quest to create a more perfect union.
Precisely. The Constitution is a framework, but it's up to us, we the people, to ensure it's used to create a just and equitable society for everyone.
So we've unpacked those early compromises, talked about amendments, and seen how the Constitution has been used to both uphold and challenge the status quo. It's amazing how much we've covered just by scratching the surface.
It's just the tip of the iceberg.
But we've only focused on the big picture so far. Time to zoom in and get into the nitty-gritty of how the government actually works.
Yes, let's dive deeper.
And that starts with Article 1, right?
Yeah.
The one about Congress, the legislative branch.
You got it. Article 1 is where the rubber meets the road when it comes to making laws. It lays out the structure and powers of Congress, which, as you might remember from our chat about the Great Compromise.
Ah, yes, the Great Compromise strikes again.
It does. It established a bicameral Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives.
Right, right. It's remarkable how that one compromise echoes throughout the structure of our government. But why did the framers choose this two-chamber system? What were they hoping to achieve?
Well, they had several goals in mind. One was to balance the interests of large and small states, which, as we discussed, was a major sticking point.
Yeah, they were really butting heads over that one.
They were. Another goal was to create checks and balances within the legislative branch itself. They believed that having two chambers, each with different structures and constituencies, would help prevent any one group from gaining too much power.
So it's like having two filters for legislation, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
That's a great way to put it. They wanted to force lawmakers to compromise and deliberate carefully before passing laws.
Smart move. So what sorts of powers does Article I actually give to Congress? What can they actually do?
Article 1 grants Congress a whole list of powers, like the power to tax, borrow money, regulate commerce, declare war, raise and support armies, and even establish a post office.
Wow, that's a lot of responsibility.
It is. These powers are specifically listed in the Constitution, which is called enumerated. This was a deliberate choice by the framers as part of their commitment to a limited government.
So Congress can't just do whatever it wants.
Right, they're bound by what the Constitution specifically allows.
But what about situations the framers couldn't have possibly predicted, like the internet or space travel?
That's where the necessary and proper clause comes in. It gives Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out those enumerated powers.
So it's like a little loophole, a bit of wiggle room to adapt to new challenges.
You could say that. This clause has been the subject of much debate and interpretation throughout history, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I bet. It seems like it could be open to a lot of different interpretations.
It definitely is. It goes to the heart of the question of how much power the federal government should have.
It's fascinating how they built this flexibility into the Constitution, recognizing that the world would change and the government would need to adapt.
It shows incredible foresight, doesn't it?
It does, but it also seems like a recipe for debate and disagreement. Who gets to decide what's necessary and proper?
Excellent question. You've hit on a key tension in American constitutional law. The balance between the specific powers given to Congress and that flexibility granted by the necessary and proper clause.
That's a tricky balance to strike.
It is, and it's a debate that continues to this day, playing out in courtrooms and legislative chambers across the country.
This is making me appreciate how carefully the Constitution was crafted. It's not just a set of rules. It's this intricate system of checks and balances. It's designed to distribute power, prevent tyranny, and allow for adaptation over time.
It's an incredible feat of political engineering, really.
Kind of is. It's brilliant.
It's a remarkable document, and we've only just begun to explore its depths.
Well, lucky for us, we have more time to delve into those depths. We'll continue our exploration in our next installment of this deep dive. But before we go, I'm curious, if you could go back in time and ask the framers just one question about Article 1 and the powers of Congress, what would it be?
That's a great question. I think I'd ask them how they envision the necessary and proper clause being used in the future. Did they anticipate the vast expansion of federal power we've seen, or would they be surprised by how that clause has been interpreted?
It's a thought-provoking question, something for our listeners to ponder as we continue our exploration.
Ready to dive back into the Constitution?
You bet. We tackled that first article, the one about Congress, how laws are made, how power is split up within the federal government. We laid the foundation for understanding this amazing document.
A solid foundation is essential, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. But a house needs more than just a foundation.
Right.
What's next on our constitutional construction project?
Well, now we move from the balance of power within the federal government to the relationship between the feds and the states.
Federalism. That intricate dance between the states and the national government.
Precisely. Article 4 is where we find that dance laid out.
So Article 4, it's all about figuring out who gets to decorate, which rooms, and who's in charge of keeping the whole house running smoothly.
You got it. Article 4 lays out the ground rules for how states interact, how new states can join the union, and the responsibilities of the federal government towards the states.
It's like establishing the rules of the house. Who takes out the trash? Who mows the lawn?
Exactly. And importantly, it was designed to prevent those state squabbles that were so problematic under the Articles of Confederation.
Right. We don't want our constitutional house turning into a battleground.
Absolutely not. The framers learned from past mistakes. They wanted a system where states kept some autonomy, their own little domains, but were also bound together in a strong, unified nation.
Unity with diversity.
Yeah.
Like, you can have different styles in each room, but the house needs to stand as one.
A perfect analogy.
The source material mentions this full faith and credit clause. What's that all about?
Ah, yes, the full faith and credit clause. It's about making sure states respect each other's legal decisions and documents.
Okay, so it's not like a credit score for states.
Not quite, though that's a fun way to think about it. Let's say you get married in one state.
Okay, I'm following.
This clause means your marriage is recognized as valid in all other states. It's about promoting consistency and legal certainty across the nation.
Makes sense. It would be chaotic if your legal status could change every time you crossed a state line.
A logistical nightmare. And Article 4 goes beyond just legal documents. It also addresses the rights of citizens when they travel or move to another state.
Interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, the Privileges and Immunities Clause prevents states from discriminating against citizens from other states. So generally, you have the same basic rights whether you're in your home state or visiting another one.
That's reassuring. So you don't lose certain rights just because you're traveling.
Exactly. The framers wanted a system where all citizens were treated fairly, regardless of their state of residence.
A fair system for everyone.
Precisely. And speaking of moving between states, Article 4 also deals with extradition.
Extradition. Okay, lay that one on me.
Sure. If a person commits a crime in one state and runs off to another, the state where the crime happened can request that person's return for trial.
So no escaping justice by crossing state lines.
Not so easy. It's like having a shared security system for the whole house. If there's trouble in one room, the whole house knows.
It sounds like Article 4 really ties the states together, legally and practically. The glue that holds our constitutional house together.
I like that analogy. It's all about creating a more unified legal and political system while still respecting the idea of federalism, those individual state domains within the larger structure.
Okay, so we've seen how Article I lays the foundation for the government. And now with Article 4, we've built some walls to define the relationships between states. But we've also talked about how the Constitution can be changed, adapted over time. Where does that fit into our blueprint?
That's where Article V comes in, and it's a big one. It outlines the process for amending the Constitution, and as you can imagine, it's pretty involved.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to change the fundamental law of the land too easily.
Exactly. Article V ensures any changes have widespread support. It requires a supermajority vote in both houses of Congress to even propose an amendment, then ratification by 3/4 of the states.
That's a lot of agreement needed, not a decision to be taken lightly.
Not at all. It reflects the framers' belief that the Constitution should be stable, enduring, but also capable of evolving over time.
So, strong but flexible, like a house built to last but with room for renovations.
Precisely. Strong bones to withstand storms, but allowing for expansions as the family grows.
The framers were pretty forward-thinking, huh?
They were remarkable. They created a system of government that has truly weathered the storms of time.
It really has. So we've got the foundation, the walls, and even a system for making changes. What's next on our blueprint? What does Article 6 cover?
Article 6 is all about establishing the supremacy of the Constitution and federal law over state laws.
So if there's a conflict, federal law wins. Like if the federal government sets the House rules and everyone follows them.
You got it. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and federal laws, made in accordance with the Constitution, are binding on the states. This is often called the Supremacy Clause.
The Supremacy Clause. It makes sense. It would undermine the whole idea of a unified nation if states could just ignore federal law.
Exactly. It would be like having different electrical systems in each room, dangerous and inefficient. The Supremacy Clause is crucial for a strong federal system.
So Article 6 makes it clear that the federal government has the final say, but it still works within a federal system where states have their own important powers.
Right. It's a balance between national unity and state sovereignty.
This is all starting to feel like a giant puzzle, each article fitting into the overall picture.
You're getting it. The Constitution isn't just random rules, it's a carefully crafted system designed to achieve specific goals. A blueprint for a functioning and lasting government.
Okay, we're down to the final article in our blueprint. Article 7. What's that about?
Article 7 outlines the process for ratifying the Constitution. It's stipulated that the Constitution would only go into effect once ratified by conventions in at least 9 states.
So not just approval from state legislatures. They had to hold special conventions. It seems like they really wanted to make sure this Constitution was built with the consent of the people, not just the politicians.
You're exactly right. The framers wanted to ensure the Constitution had broad popular support, so they went directly to the people through these special conventions.
That's a pretty big deal. It shows how seriously they took this whole process of establishing a new government. They were creating a whole new framework for a nation.
They understood the gravity of what they were doing, and they wanted to get it right.
This is giving me such a deeper appreciation for the complexity of the Constitution. We've talked about those main articles, the foundation, the walls, but there's another whole layer we haven't really explored: the amendments.
Ah, yes, the amendments. They're crucial to the Constitution's story, reflecting how it has adapted to social and political change over time.
Like adding on rooms, updating the decor, keeping our constitutional house feeling fresh and functional.
A perfect analogy.
We've touched on the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments protecting our basic freedoms, and the Reconstruction Amendments, which tackled the legacy of slavery. But what about the other 17 amendments? What kind of renovations and additions have they brought?
Well, there are amendments covering a huge range of issues, from presidential term limits to voting rights. Each amendment tells a story about a specific moment in American history and how the Constitution has evolved to meet new challenges and embrace new values.
It's like our constitutional house is constantly undergoing renovations to meet the needs of its occupant.
Exactly, always adapting and evolving.
So how do these amendments fit into the structure of the Constitution? Are they like separate blueprints?
Think of them more like additions to the original document, but they carry the same weight and authority. They're fully integrated into the overall design.
That means the Constitution is a living document, adapting to changing circumstances while still upholding its core principles.
Exactly. It's like a house that can grow and change with the times without losing its character. A testament to the framers' foresight.
They built a house that was meant to last, and they gave us the tools to keep it in good shape.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. All those articles and amendments, it's a lot to take in. It's like we've toured a massive, beautifully designed house, seen all its hidden nooks and crannies.
We've certainly covered a lot of ground, but remember, it's just the beginning. As you explore the Constitution further, you'll discover new layers of meaning. It's like living in a house. You're constantly discovering new things, even after years.
Well, we'll have to save those discoveries for another deep dive. But before we wrap up this part of our exploration, any final thoughts for our listener who's been on this journey with us?
Absolutely. As you delve deeper, consider how the balance of power between the federal government and the states has shifted over time. What does that mean for the future of American democracy?
It's amazing to think we started with just a blueprint,
Mm-hmm.
and now we've built this whole constitutional house together.
It's been quite a journey. From the foundation to the roof, all those rooms and the rules, it's impressive how it all fits together.
Right. This complex and enduring structure we call the U.S. Constitution.
More than just a document, it's a living, breathing framework for a nation.
We've talked about so much. The government structure, the balance of power, how it can be changed, the relationships between states and the feds.
A lot to unpack, for sure.
Is there anything we've missed? Any secret rooms in our constitutional house?
Well, there's always more to explore, but there's one key aspect we haven't delved into. The court's role in interpreting the Constitution.
Oh, the courts.
Right.
They're vital for breathing life into those words on the page. They have to figure out how to apply the Constitution's principles to real-world situations.
I see. So they're not just there to settle arguments between people.
It's much bigger than that. They grapple with complex questions about how those principles play out in practice.
Can you give us an example?
Absolutely. Think about the 14th Amendment. It guarantees equal protection of the laws.
Right. Everyone should be treated equally under the law. Seems pretty straightforward.
You'd think so. But it took decades of court battles to really define what that means.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't so clear-cut after all.
Not at all. Consider school segregation, for instance. It took the Brown v. Board of Education case in 1954 for the Supreme Court to say that separate schools for black and white students were unconstitutional.
So it took the courts to say that separate but equal wasn't really equal.
Exactly. They overturned that old doctrine and said it violated the 14th Amendment. So the courts are kind of like referees, making sure everyone's following the rules of the Constitution.
That's a good analogy. They act as arbiters, interpreting the Constitution, resolving conflicts between different parts of the government or between the feds and the states.
They make sure the House rules are fair and consistent.
Precisely. And there's also this thing called judicial review.
Judicial review. Okay, I've heard that term, but I'm not really sure what it means.
It's the court's power to declare laws or executive actions unconstitutional.
Whoa, so they can basically say, nope, that's not allowed. It goes against the Constitution.
Exactly. It's like having a building inspector who can come in and say, this addition doesn't meet code. Got to tear it down.
That's a lot of power for the courts to have.
It is a significant power. And it wasn't specifically spelled out in the Constitution. It was established through the case of Marbury v. Madison in 1803.
So the courts basically said, hey, this is our job. We get to do this.
They asserted their authority, and it stuck. This solidified their role as guardians of the Constitution. They have a duty to uphold it, even if it means overturning things Congress or the president have done.
It's like a powerful check on the other branches of government.
It's crucial for that checks and balances system we talked about. It keeps any one branch from getting too powerful.
Makes sense. So the courts have this huge responsibility to interpret the Constitution.
They do. And it's not always easy, especially when dealing with issues the framers couldn't have imagined.
Right, like the internet or artificial intelligence. Those weren't exactly on their radar back then.
Exactly. But the courts have to find ways to apply those old principles to our modern world. It's a constant process of interpretation and adaptation.
This is giving me a whole new understanding of how the Constitution works and how important the courts are.
They are essential. They shape how we understand our rights and freedoms.
It's incredible to think how much impact this one document has had, not just in the U.S., but around the world. The source material mentioned that, other countries have looked to the U.S. Constitution as a model.
It's true. Many countries have borrowed ideas from it, particularly the emphasis on individual rights and that separation of powers.
So our constitutional house has inspired others to build their own houses with similar features.
You could say that. It's remarkable how influential it's been.
It really is. But the source material also mentions some criticisms of the Constitution. It wasn't perfect, right? Even the best houses have flaws.
Of course. No document is perfect. The Constitution was a product of its time, reflecting the limitations and biases of that era.
Like using the best materials and technology available at the time, but knowing future generations might need to make some upgrades.
Exactly. It wasn't a perfect blueprint.
What are some of those flaws? Those areas where the original design didn't quite live up to its ideals?
Well, as we've discussed, it didn't initially grant voting rights to women or people of color, and it took a long and painful struggle to address the issue of slavery.
Those are pretty major shortcomings. It's like building a house with separate entrances for different groups of people.
You're right. And those flaws had real lasting consequences. Think about the 3/5 Compromise, a deeply flawed attempt to reconcile the interests of slaveholding states with the principles of equality. It took the Reconstruction Amendments to finally abolish slavery and begin extending full citizenship rights to African Americans.
So the Constitution has been shaped by social movements, political struggles, new interpretations.
Absolutely. It's a testament to the strength of American democracy that it's been able to adapt and evolve over time.
It's a living document, constantly being reinterpreted and debated.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating. It's not just a dusty old text. It's a vital part of our ongoing national conversation about who we are and what we stand for.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes. I feel like I have a much richer understanding of the Constitution now. It's not just a document. It's a story, a reflection of our nation's journey.
It's been an incredible journey exploring it together, and I hope our listeners feel the same way.
Me too. It's like we've taken this amazing tour of our constitutional house, seen all its grandeur and complexities.
And remember, the exploration doesn't end here. The Constitution is something we can all engage with, learn from, and even argue about. It's a document for everyone.
Well said. It's a reminder that this house, this nation, belongs to all of us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure, and until next time, keep those constitutional conversations going.